Welcome to the Smart Men Under God Guidance channel, SMUG, where we explore and look at breakthrough innovative technology that will change and reorganize the world we live in and the companies and men behind these endeavors. The true Maroon story. Because of the ambiguity in the Jamaican society and the loss of essential elements of the Maroon story to history, I have compiled this audio from the Handbook of Jamaica for 1884-85, by A.C. Sinclair, Government Printing Establishment and Laurence R. Fyfe, Colonial Secretary's Office, which were compiled from official and other reliable records in order to make available to the broader Jamaican public an easier accessible source of information in order to dispel rumors and misinformation surrounding the Maroons so that we can discuss the topic from a more informed perspective. The Maroons, by the Reverend John Radcliffe. In the year 1665, Jamaica, after having been under Spanish rule for above 150 years, became a British possession. Though the fight for the capture of the island was brief, the struggle for the retention was severe and continuous and arose from the twofold cause: the repeated efforts of the Spaniard to regain possession of the island, and the existence of the large number of slaves which Spaniard had liberated and left behind. These, subsequently called Maroons, are to be distinguished from the runaway Negroes, who from time to time join them in their hostile aggressions. As such, they are to be regarded by us as the professed to be not as rebel, for they had never acknowledged the authority of England, but as people fighting for the possession of the country which the English invaded. This position of enemies and not rebels was conceded by the English in the treaties in which they subsequently entered with the Maroons. The origin of the name is obscured and as a consequence has its difficulty. The difficulty is this: that they are in Guyana, British, as well as in Jamaica, Maroons. Whatever therefore be origin of the term, whether a word, a fact, or a locality, it must be such as to be ample enough and early enough to include both. Whether it was so or not, we find that Maroons is acknowledged to be sprung from the Spanish word cimarron, which signify wild either as to savagery or courage. In this uncertainty as to its original application, it is not unnatural to suppose that while the term was employed by their enemies as one of contempt, yet likely klepts robbers of Thessaly, who in their struggle for liberty of modern Greece, afterwards assume and accept the name as one of glory, and like the Hollanders who when called beggars took the name of beggars of the sea Jusde Meer and their appellative. Without being able exactly to say when, in Jamaica, it was first assigned or assumed, it may be slated as a fact corroborative of what has been advanced as to the appropriation of the name, that it was about the time of the culmination of the Maroon power that the name became so distinctive and distinguished. From their first aggregation they were a formidable body, so much so that Sedgwick, who might be called virtually the first president or governor of the island, after it being taken, says to Thurlow, "Be assured they must either be destroyed, or brought in on some terms or others, or else they will prove a great discouragement to the settling of the people here, Jamaica." As illustrative and historical, we find that in the year 1668, Bolus became their leaders, and that while conditions were offered by D'Oyly and a large number of Bolus's followers accepted the condition, there still rallied round him a considerable number of followers. These, retiring to the mountain fastnesses, living by plundering the planters, and increasing in their numbers by the accession of runaway slaves, became a source of annoyance and alarm. The haunt of this early, if not indeed first Maroon chief, is indicated by the mountain fastness in St. John's Parish, which bears the name till this day. It would be far beyond the limits of this paper to sketch the history of these mountains chiefs, during the 76 years between Bolus and Cudjoe. The Maroons, however, had been growing to great strength, partly by the laws of increase, and very much by the accession of fugitive Negroes. At the time Cudjoe, at the head of a large number of followers at the river cave, was joined by another large number from Clarendon, which two parties assumed the name of Cotta Woods. Whether Cudjoe was connected with the Maroons by birth, or whether it is that though the old Maroons had nearly died out, yet as their principles were no adopted as the principles of their new and powerful aggregation, the name Maroon was taken as the name of the party. Whatever may have been the amount of Maroon blood in Cudjoe, if any, or the number of Maroons in the organization, there can be little doubt that it was infused with the Maroon spirit. By their warfare now assuming a more systematic form, by the influence of irregular discipline, by their knowledge of the fastnesses which to the English were almost inaccessible, they were able to carry on a war so harassing and annoying that the English government was obliged to come to negotiation with Cudjoe, and enter into a covenant with him, as with a belligerent power. A treaty of pacification was accordingly signed on March 1, 1738, in which amid other things it was stipulated, Art 3, that they shall enjoy and possess for themselves and their posterity forever, all the lands situated and lying between Trelawney town, and the cockpit to the amount of 15,000 acres, bearing northwest of Trelawney town, and that they shall have the right to plant said lands, and rear hogs. In the following year, June 23, 1739, more articles were entered into with other Maroons leaders, Accompong, Johnny, Cuffy, and Quaco, and as a consequence, and very soon were established the 5 Maroon towns: Trelawney Town, Accompong Town, Scots Hall, Moortown, and Charlestown. The position of the Maroons being now changed from one of hostility to one of alliance, a bill was passed in the House of Assembly in the year 1744 for raising companies from the above-mentioned towns, and for encouraging them to reduce rebellions and runaway slaves. Nor was it long before their service were needed and obtained. In the parish of St. Mary broke out a most savage conspiracy among the slaves. This was organized and conducted by 2 Coromantee Negroes, Tacky and Jamaica, with the object of extirpating the whites. The time was Easter Monday. The fort at Port Maria was seized, and all the white inhabitants of the neighborhood were murdered at supper. One gentleman, Mr. Bailey, escaped, and after rallying a number of dependents, drove the slaves into the woods. Martial law was proclaimed, the troops called out, and, at the same time, the Maroons. Though some insinuations have been made by some historian as to the faithfulness of the Maroons on this occasion, yet we find that it was by the Maroons that Tacky was shot, and that in the House of Assembly it was reported that the Maroons did good service during the late rebellion. In 1795 began what may really be called the Maroon War. The Earl of Balcarres, who in that year arrived as governor, found on his coming that Maroons of Trelawney were in a discontented condition. By the terms of the treaty with Cudjoe, 2 white men, but only 2 were to reside as superintendents. One of these, to whom they were much attached, was removed, and the other, who had been appointed in his place, was declared incompetent for the duties of his situation. The irritation which these acts produced was increased by an unfortunate occurrence. The treaty above mentioned provided that in the treatment of culprits the Maroons should exercise their own mode of adjudication, and administer and punishment they chose, short of death. In the face of this, 2 of their numbers had been flogged in workhouse by a slave driver, and in the presence of some slaves they had already captured. It cannot be denied that this was contrary to the treaty. Nor could it be expected that anything but bitterness of feeling should be the result. Whether it was that the scene of Haiti, which had filled all Jamaica with uneasiness, had an undue influence on the mind of Balcarres, it is difficult to say, but scarcely had he arrived when he recommended to the House of Assembly the most vigorous measures against the Maroons. The amount of petulancy, obstinacy, and impatience with which he urged General Walpole to carry out his plans, are very painful for us to read, and must have been more painful to that high-minded and kind man to endure. The war notwithstanding was protracted, and the chasseurs with their dogs were introduced to hunt and kill the Maroons, and although these dogs never really were let loose yet, overcome with the fear of these dogs, the Maroons at last surrendered, on the faith of the secret and sworn promise on the part of General Walpole that they would not be sent out of the colony. In grim punctuality as to the today mentioned for coming in and surrendering, and in forgetfulness of the difficulty which these people had to encounter in the bringing in at the appointment day from their different hiding places their wives and children, Balcarras treated them as if they had not kept faith, and in spite of the pledge given by General Walpole, he, with the concurrence of the House of Assembly, caused the Trelawney Maroons to be expatriated to Nova Scotia. So much did General Walpole feel this that while the Assembly voted him a sword of the value of 500 guineas, he refused it, and in a letter to the Speaker said, "But as the House has not thought fit to accede to the agreement entered into between me and the Trelawney Maroons, and as the opinion of that treaty stands on their minutes very different to my conception of it, I am compelled to the decline honor which you have intended for me." And to Nova Scotia where they sent, then to Sierra Leone, at which place they seem to have lost their tribal individuality. From what had thus taken place it could scarcely have been expected that there would have remained, or have been restored, the same relationship between the Maroons and the government of Jamaica, or in other words of England. We find, however, from the records of the Assembly, that some 8 years after they were petitions from the magistrate and others of Portland for the restoration of the Maroons to the confidence of the white inhabitants of the country, as they were willing to obey the orders of the governor and were willing to fight for the defense of the country, open however not to be sent to sea, and that they would help to bring in any runaways and to be placed on the same footing as before the rebellion of the Trelawney Maroons. This was accepted, and hence is there found year after year, as recorded in the votes of the Assembly, bill after bill to empower the Commander-in-Chief to employ the Maroons for this island and for its defense and security, to adopt measures for making them more useful, to give returns on the exact oath of the superintendents of the Maroons within several towns, with their claims, to extend Maroon towns to a more healthy part of the island and to regulate and improve the Maroons, and make them more serviceable to the island. These bills, with others of a similar sort, covered the space of time between 1804 and 1817, while after that from the year 1820 till 1856 they are presented the yearly returns of the number of Maroons in the island, along which there are the incidental and acknowledged claims of those who had been disabled in consequence of their service, and petitions for remuneration for service during the rebellion of 1832 to 1833, and at last by the late Mr. Jordan, in 1856, a bill for the allotment of land and for the Maroons. After this we heard legislative little if anything about the Maroons. As to their present number, it is difficult to ascertain accurately what is the amount in each of the 4 towns respectively. Perhaps about 15 to 1600 would include all. They are still governed by their own laws, and it is seldom that a Maroon is before any of our ordinary courts. Punishment, as it was stipulated in the treaty with Cudjoe, are still administrated by themselves to their own criminals. On this point they are very jealous, and as a proof of efficacy of their internal police, they point to the conduct of their people. Although living on good terms with their neighbors, they continue in a state of comparative isolation, disliking, as they do, an intermixture with any other tribe, and shrinking from the sea. They still retain their military organization and graduation, although since rebellion of 1865 they have not, as they had from the beginning, a white colonel, Colonel Fyfe, who is still remembered by them with much affection, being the last that Maroons of Accompong have selected as their ruler and chieftainess Mrs. Strachan of Medina. In religious matters the Maroons are not in advance of their neighbors. As a rule, they belong to the Church of England, exception of those Accompong, who belonged to the Church of Scotland. In that town a very commodious church has been built, of which the Reverend J. Stewart is minister, and belong to which is a communion roll amounting nearly 100. In looking back on the history of these people, it is impossible not to be struck with several things in connection with their history and character. In the first place, they must have been a brave people to have resisted the power of England so long, and never to yield until the establishment of an amicable treaty between England and them. It is hard, if not impossible, to point under similar circumstances to any bravery in the world more successful. Cudjoe and Quaco, though not euphonious, are immortal names. In the next place, from the time of the treaty to the present time, they acted up to the obligation of the treaty. Not only do the records of the House of Assembly, but one of the latest, if not one of the last, of the statements of their last Colonel, Colonel Fyfe, testifies to that effect. On the breaking out of the rebellion in 1832 to 1833, he says, when most of the properties on the northwest end of the island were laid waste, I got, through my influence with the Maroons of Moorestown and Charlestown, a body of men to accompany me to disturb. The officers those gladly accepted by Lord Belmore, and I landed with 100 men at Falmouth. Besides thousands of prisoners that surrendered, we bought 500 out of the woods crossing the cockpits that had been so fatal to the white troops during the Trelawney Maroon War in 1795. We were engaged 3 months in these operations, and on their conclusion Sir Willoughby Cotton, the general commanding, told me that with my Maroons I had been of more service in the rebellion than the whole troops and militia to put together. I am George O. Smith. Please like, share, and subscribe to my channel, so I can bring you more innovative technology breakthroughs. Welcome to the Smart Man.